Tonight on The Experience, we'll talk about some of the stories that are happening in the city of Worcester. We'll talk about Worcester Magazine and how they are covering those stories, and we'll shamelessly plug the Hank and Walter on Worcester podcast. So that's coming up. But right now, there is a brand new show in the area that we would love for you to tune into. It is called Perspectives, 2 o'clock on Saturdays on AM 830 WCRN. And Asima, thank you so much for being here. You are the host. This is a show that comes from a perspective of American Muslims. And I wanted to, I'll have you set it up, but I think that for me, and I will say right up front, I am involved in the show, but what for me is great about the fact that you wanted to do the show is one thing that I think that we have heard so much over the years is that where is the, if anything that happens in the news, where is the Muslim voice? And the underlying theme being that, it's not out there, nobody is speaking up. Here you are, a Muslim woman, and you are going to be speaking up about these issues that are in the news. Well,
we've always found that in the last few years that Muslims have spoken out. We just don't get the media attention. So when we were offered this opportunity, of course, I did think about it at first because, being one of the first people to go into this area is a little scary. But we couldn't give up the opportunity because if the media is offering us a chance to voice our opinion and our stories, we have to take it. For example, a couple years ago, 30 major scholars, well-known scholars, wrote an open letter to ISIS condemning their actions and proclaiming that their actions do not follow in any way, shape, or form Islamic guidelines or principles, but it was never aired, it was never shown, it was never read out loud to the public. It's found online. If you look up, ISIS letter from scholars, an open letter, you will very easily find it. But it was never actually told. The story was never told. And we always hear, why aren't the Muslims speaking up about ISIS? And now we kind of find it that because Muslims are the majority victims of ISIS, we hear a little bit of it, but we could have heard about this 2 years ago that Muslims were condemning.
Yeah, it's interesting. You just mentioned something at the beginning, though. You said, you had to stop and think about this, and that it was a little scary.
Yes.
Because the fact is that now there are those out there who just, anything Muslim. There is a backlash, or you have felt this backlash at previous times. And now you will be a voice, you will be a name that is attached to a show, and there's no doubt that there are people who may decide then, good, there's somebody that I can write to or send something to or focus on.
Right.
So that's the scary part.
That's the scary part, because when we were thinking about this show, even when I was talking about it publicly before, it was in small settings. So maybe 50 people or 100 people, versus as doing something like this show where it could be repeated and heard and recorded. It's a little scary because you don't know who's listening to it. Right. A lot of the venues that I would speak in is interfaith meetings or school settings where people are generally more open-minded and open to hearing and be educated. Whereas when you're talking about a radio show, you don't know who's actually listening in, and you become the face that maybe is the face of their anger or misunderstanding, and that's something I had to think about.
Because boy, what a catch-22, because at the same time, those are the people that you really would like to reach, and it may take a lot longer, or you may never be able to get through, but those are the people that you would like to be able to hear your voice and be able to hear that conversation. All right, let's talk a little bit about the show itself, Perspectives. Some of the first issues that you have tackled. As I say, I'm very pleased to be able to be a part of the show and be involved. One of the first issues that you tackled, as a matter of fact, this just aired in the last week, was about the imam who was shot in New York City, in Queens. This was clearly targeted simply because of his faith and the fact that he was leaving a mosque. I don't think that there is any evidence that the shooter knew who it was, other than it was somebody walking out of a mosque.
Right, because he's an imam and he had his assistant with him. Most likely, from the pictures that I've seen in the news, seems like he was wearing a traditional, attire. So obviously, looking like he's a Muslim. And coming out of the mosque, which was his routine after, obviously praying at the mosque, this leads the Muslims to believe it was definitely a hate crime. Again, it hasn't been classified as a hate crime yet, but with all the hate crimes that have been happening all over the United States, this definitely was a little close to home for someone who was just worshiping, and for someone to be killed because they were worshiping from a mosque or exiting an area of worship. becomes very scary, because this is just like if you replace nouns with another noun, that's like having a priest assassinated when he was exiting a church. How would the community at that point feel? And how would they feel about now worshiping or going to a place of worship? It's one of those areas that has always been a sanctity of peace, right? It's always been an area where violence is not really, even people of other faiths really respect a place of worship. And there's been an unspoken code throughout times, throughout all, eras and centuries, where in places of worship, violence is not done. And this is kind of where I think a lot of the Muslims have felt fearful that if this is where it's going.
And there's just one of the shows. We'll talk a little bit more about the show. We'll talk a little bit more about you as well. Born in Rutland and
Yes.
Went through the Wachusett school system, and I want to talk a little bit about that straight ahead right here on the Hank Stoltz Experience.
I am woman, hear me roar, in numbers too big to ignore, and I know too much to go back and pretend.
Talking about a new radio program that is in the area. It is called Perspectives with Asima Silva, and Asima joins us now. And it is perspectives from your perspective, but also from the perspective of somebody who is an American Muslim. And you were born in Rutland,
right,
and went through the Wachusett school system. The reason that I bring that up is because your experience is the experience that most kids who grew up in the suburbs had.
Right.
Do we put a little bit too much on the fact that show with an American Muslim,
Yes.
Asima Silva, your experience is the same experience that the other kids going to Wachusett had, by and large, I would think.
By and large, exactly. I mean, yes, some people might say I was probably one of the only minorities in the district, but I never had a problem. In fact, I grew to love the area. I moved into the area, wanted my kids to be raised in the area. Again, it's, I think, education and knowing someone. And when I was doing Perspectives, I thought about this, and people kept asking me, what's so different about this show than other things that you can see on the internet? You could Google, what is Sharia, or, what is a Muslim believe in, what is Islam? And I said, you know what, a lot of people can do that. You can go to the wrong sites, but a lot of people can get that information. But I think a lot of people would be interested in knowing what an average Muslim who has grown up in this country, even locally, what their views are and how they live their life and what their perspectives are.
Yeah, no, I think that hits the nail on the head. That there is so much more that brings us together through the shared experiences that we
Right.
have living in this area than could ever possibly separate us. And I wanted to ask this question as well. It does seem as if, because there is such intense scrutiny now on religion. Geez, I know an awful lot of Christians who show up on Christmas Day, and I don't see them in the pew, every Sunday. I'm assuming that that's the same for, that there are plenty of secular Muslims who, sure,
Right.
You're a Muslim, but they're not going to the mosque 5 times a day.
Yeah, we have the same issues that I think the Christians and Jews are going through. I'm all involved in Worcester Interfaith, and whenever I've talked to a few of the pastors and priests, they have said the same thing, that they're having a lack of youth coming to their places of worship. And we are experiencing the same, but maybe a little bit more, and it's not because of reasons that we share, some of the reasons that we share, but some of the reasons out of fear. Some youth are just shying away from being associated or being a Muslim because of the fear of backlash that they might entail. For example, if they wear a hijab, if a girl decides to wear a hijab, she now has just symbolized herself as a Muslim before anybody gets a chance to talk to her, before she opens her mouth. There have been incidents where people have told a Muslim woman, go back home, and when she opens her mouth, they realize that she's American and came from New Jersey.
Right.
So
Right.
It's very difficult for the youth, especially Muslim youth. I
Well,
think.
but also, a perspective of a woman's perspective that is being brought to the show too. And
Right.
obviously, over the last couple of weeks, nationally, there was a spotlight shined on our Muslim women able to even speak. And here you are doing your own radio show.
Right.
So-
I think people need to be educated, and that's what this show is really aiming to do, is Muslim women have always spoken out. Muslim women had the right to vote 1,400 years ago. They had the right to get divorced 1,400 years ago. And most people don't realize that. Yes, culture has seeped in a lot of the countries. So a lot of Muslim majority countries, I think most people look at Muslim majority countries to look for what Islam stands for. Unfortunately, some of the culture has dictated rather than the religion. And we sometimes mistaken one for the other. But in terms of religion, the Muslim women had many rights. In terms of their right to education, just as much as a man has a right to education.
Yeah.
So I just believe that I live truly to more of my religion than to my culture. And living more to my religion just makes me a better American citizen.
Yeah, that's interesting too about culture versus religion. We could probably do a whole series
section,
of
yes.
shows just on that. Let's give people a little bit of the flavor of what they will see in the coming weeks. For example, I know that you have an upcoming show about Tulsa, Oklahoma. Here's the case where there was somebody who was a very bigoted individual, ends up killing the individual next door to him because, here's the words that he was using, dirty Arab and Muslim. This person was a Christian.
Right.
And no matter how many times he would speak to this guy, the guy just wouldn't go along with
Right.
it, and had all of this anger, and it ends up in his killing his neighbor.
Right, and I think that goes back to hatred and discrimination. When you discriminate against a particular group, you're not discriminating only against that group. Because how can we tell? If you discriminate against a woman, you ultimately will discriminate against your mother, your sister, your relative. If you discriminate against Arabs, you're going to involve at some point Christians and Jews and other ethnicities. So I think that's where the problem lies, and that's what I'm hoping to dispel.
Boy, and we have another show that is coming up on Perspectives. Very dramatic story. Young man, graduate of WPI, still living here in this area. Unable really to go back home to Pakistan, where his father stood up to the Taliban
Right.
and was assassinated.
Right, and I really thought that show was really important to do because at some point I feel that after the Khizr Khan story, and again, kudos to that Gold Star family, but a lot of Americans, I think, were starting to get to feel that, okay, we'll accept American Muslims as long as they're in the military and willing to defend this country. And I think Ozzy's story that we will be doing is actually shows that people, regardless if they're American or Muslim or not, everyone is fighting against violence in their own way. And it doesn't have to be just on this soil.
Well, again, thank you so much for putting the show together, bringing the show to us, and having it on in our area, and look forward to people tuning into it.
Thank you for being involved in it.
Great, thank you. All right, and much more to come right here. We're going to talk about some other issues. We'll talk about what's happening at Worcester Magazine, and I'll put in a shameless plug for the Hank and Walter on Worcester podcast. That's all on the way on the Hank Stoltz Experience.
It's a little bit mean.